Joined by Arsene, Joachim, and Dominic, and myself, Gabrielle, on the Hypha core team. And today we thought we'd try and wrestle with this concept of knowledge management from a decentralized perspective, from a decentralized organization perspective, and also bringing in a relatively popular theme, an up and coming theme, kind of a longer term future thinking theme of knowledge graphs. And we'll try to describe a little bit about what that is. And we're including how do we generally approach sense making and collective intelligence, recording agreements with increasing complexity in our surroundings, in our environment, in all of the relationships that we have to have with small vendors and big vendors and individual contributors, and all of the prioritization. And we've got the artificial intelligence, not only to utilize for ourselves, but we're also in some ways competing with as well. So there's a whole big blend of knowledge management that has to step up to speed, accelerate with the times, and how that factors in with us approaching organizational structure, organizational development, and making work fun, as we spoke about in a recent internal meeting as well. So maybe you want to go around the table and get some initial comments. I've got a knowledge graph visual representation that I can share on screen in a few moments. But first of all, maybe let's get some first comments.
Great topic. Thank you for the introduction, Gabriel. Let's start with this big topic of knowledge management. And let me take a little bit of a sort of traditional approach where it came from and how does that actually relate to what we're doing now in a, as you said, decentralized space. So knowledge management came from a very centralized space, from an organizational space. Personally, I was involved during my other life when I'm working as a consultant in HR. I worked a lot with knowledge management. Also was a knowledge management practitioner for a long, long time. And what we did within, these centralized, consulting organizations that are, essentially based on knowledge, it's all about knowledge. And the more knowledge you have in your head, the more power you have in a consulting organization, right? So it's all about, silos of knowledge and eventually the step towards sharing that kind of knowledge. And that was part of my task to say, look, there's all this knowledge floating around. How do we get this organized? And that's exactly the task of knowledge management, right? To find very structured ways, centralized ways to say, here's the knowledge that this company, this organization has. Here is a taxonomy, for that kind of knowledge, right? Exactly, terms structured and how it's guided and provided and subdivided. And here's even an ontology around that, to say, yes, we are in consulting, we're in HR consulting. So what are the typical, ontologies you can use out there to help structure that content? Second piece of traditional knowledge management is related to content management. So these are the typical content production processes, right? To sort of capture the content, classify the content, put it in your databases, right? And make it accessible through, let's say your intranet. One big thing was creating an intranet for all employees where you can access that knowledge, right? So we built a lot of this stuff at that company, but it was very much centralized, right? There was a centralized technology group building the technology, capturing that in another group, and then putting it onto the intranet. So it had a lot to do with the content management and publishing processes, with the asset management, with the repositories that were necessary, right? Like a file repository. Where do we put our documents? And how do we build a file structure for all of the documents that we share internally inside this organization, right? And then the data repositories too, right? How do we create the properties around these files and around that content to make sure we can retrieve it through then also another thing, which is a search engine that's typically added on top of the intranet to make it all accessible to employees. That's the classic picture, that's what is still happening in today's, organizations, that's what the understanding of knowledge management in that space is. But now let's move fast forward a little bit because I want to, hand it over to the others here before we get into sort of the other topic of these structured knowledge graphs, that are now evolving in these spaces. But for me, this is now about the shift from, a centralized repository that is owned and controlled by a single person towards a decentralized way of accessing the knowledge. And this is, to me, now the connection towards the DAO, right? So DAOs are organizations, are entities, really, and they have a lot of knowledge that they're building up, and they have a lot of knowledge to share, and increasingly share openly, because not everything is protected, not everything is IP, not everything is copyrighted. So there are ways to actually opening this up and say, look, we're working on some problems. Here are some solutions. We're willing to share that because you are part of a group of people I'm working with, or you're part of the ecosystem I'm part of. So we got to start sharing this more openly because we're solving these problems together. This isn't a competitive space, you against me. This isn't a consultancy where the more knowledge I hoard and sit on, the more powerful I am. This is you and me working together to solve these problems. So this is the shift that we see happening now, especially in the decentralized Web3 space, in the DAO space, where we're much more likely to say, hey, here's a good solution. Why don't we try this out? And not only that, why don't you try to improve on that solution, right? So that knowledge can flow much more freely within and among all of the participants in the network. So that for me is the sort of the bigger picture before we get into the sort of the details of what the knowledge actually looks like, how it's structured, and what we could, make more available out there for others to work and build upon.
Yeah, I just want to jump in because for me, I don't know if we were, because for me, this term was connected to the personal knowledge management and kind of appearance of the whole tooling in last 3 or 4 years around that. I think it became very popular with tools such as ROM, uh, like Notion to certain extent, Obsidian, and this whole appearance. I think it started with this popular course, which was called, I think, Building Second Brain. But basically, it started this whole movement that is becoming more and more popular, which idea is that we consume a lot of things online and offline. And all of this knowledge kind of, if we are not able to kind of gather somewhere this knowledge and kind of reiterate over that knowledge, we used to forget on this. So I think from the personal standpoint that, and I kind of become interested into that at one point, and I think it stemmed from this guy, Nicholas Luhmann, who was having this methodology, Zettelkasten, which is basically the way of kind of grouping nodes and way of linking nodes, which he was doing actually on the papers, like on small cards. But then this type of thinking is very natural to the internet and to the computers, right? So I just see this type, like this connection between personal knowledge management tools and DAO in a big way, where there is this kind of huge knowledge generated by DAOs, and also the way kind of DAOs are handled from policies to the roles, and then how can all benefit from that. That's just kind of my take on connection between these two. But maybe Dominic has something else.
No, I just this is a kind of a new concept to me as someone who is around a lot of tech and Web3 and AI and consuming everything I possibly can. I hadn't really come across these, and so it was about a month and a half ago when I first kind of started hearing about knowledge graphs and how they might, assist with AI and all this stuff. I started looking into it, and it's a kind of an odd concept to get at first, right? Because they talk about nodes and edges, and in my mind, I kept thinking blockchain nodes. I kept going like, what? Do you have to build like a damn like network of miners? Like, what does that mean? But now I understand that, the node is actually like an item, like a person or a DAO or whatever. And the edges are the relationships between them and correlations and whatnot. So I was just using my friend ChatGPT and, saying kind of like, how would this work with DAOs? And it was talking about like, data pre-processing, incorporating metadata, allowing for analysis and querying, integrate it with applications. And I said, well, what are the main benefits and enhance decision making? By visualizing relationships and patterns, DAO members can make informed decisions on proposals, collaborations, and investments. like community analysis, fraud detection, so on. I'm not going to read them all. There were a lot, but I start to put it together and go, okay, I get it. So it's like the relationships, because data is like a roaring river these days. It just flows at you all day long. You're constantly seeing information from all these sources. I have all these windows open around me. I have 3 screens. Like, it's just data. But what matters is the relationships, right? What makes the data meaningful? How can I use it in a way that makes my life better, solves a problem, makes me rich, whatever, right? Like, it needs to have a use case. And so what I see is like knowledge graphs. Um, Now I can see the thing with AI, because I can imagine, like, you wouldn't need, a trillion knowledge graphs to train an AI, like you need a trillion, tokens to train ChatGPT, right? Like, they need that much because their algorithm over time had to draw those correlations, right? It had to learn to make those associations. Then, of course, it had to have people jump in, and that's the whole reinforcement learning, right? But so even then, it needed humans to say, no, this matters to this, and this matters to that, and these go together. So I could see that, like, knowledge graphs could, I mean, they sound to me like the foundation for AGI. Like, that's how we'll achieve it, because they're so complex in the interrelationships, and it just tells you so much about, like, what makes information meaningful, and it's the relationships. And I know that's simple, but I never thought of it that way before, right? It's not the content, it's the relationships. It's just, I don't know, it's a pretty cool idea, concept.
Yeah, that was great. So let me actually share my screen, and I want to try and keep this as relevant as possible. This is not meant to be a techies conversation, right? This is really, in my mind, super practical and relevant to anyone who wants to do a decentralized organization that likes the idea of a DAO, that likes the idea of collaborating with excellent information at their fingertips and excellent access to people who can contribute towards their organizational purpose, whether it be partners or individual members of their DAO, or subject matter experts as advisors or anything like that. So that's the context I want to try and keep this in because of our audience. And so let me give you this quick demonstration. I think this could be entertaining and fun, especially for people who haven't seen this kind of thing before. So I'm sharing my screen now. Arsene mentioned Obsidian as one tool. This is what I've been using for a couple of years. I've got thousands of nodes. And in the context of Obsidian, a node can be a page, so a piece of content, like you open up your notepad or your Google document or Hedge Docs, as Joachim uses a lot in Hypha. Whatever your note taking application is, it can be a page, and each one of those pages could be a node, and another node could be a tag. So a keyword, like you said, Dom, that you're creating relationships between things. So what I've done, and I'll show you the filter. I guess you can see this on the screen. Up here, I know it's a little bit small, but I've eliminated a bunch of folders that we don't need to look at for now. And then I've added there the word Hypha. So this has pulled up every page in my Obsidian database, which is just markdown text files, right? Simple text files put into a vault, a folder. And this is any of my notes that contain the word Hypha. Now watch what happens. So what we've got, we can zoom in a little bit. There's nothing like private here, just some titles of different notes in my database. And there's a lot of days that I talk about Hypha. So it's in the day note. And then there's specific things like Hypha flow call on resources and those types of different topics that we talk about. And I store notes there. And then this has relationships. We can see the lines that go between the different things, and that forms out of backlinks. So in one note, I can refer to another note by adding a couple of brackets and link one note to a different node. And now I have a connection, and that becomes a relationship or an edge in the technical language. So I got nodes and edges. And now watch what happens when I visually on my screen, when I delete the word Hypha. And now we're seeing more of my pages in my knowledge graph So this is the concept of a graph view, a visualization of this knowledge graph. And now we can see these are more pages, but I'm still excluding literature notes in the filter. So I'll delete that. And then we see how it explodes into even bigger, more amazing universe of these edges and nodes. And so I'll just delete that filter and then just see what happens now. You see how that explodes into even more content that it's painting, and we can see clusters of things. And these clusters emerge when we are connecting the relationships between certain topics. So that might be a central contents page that relates to maybe just literature, or maybe it's a timeline of history, or maybe it's favorite authors, or whatever the subject is. And then that connects to those relevant pages, and then some pages connect to other pages, and we can have tags in there. So that's a visual representation of hundreds, if not thousands, of pages in my personal knowledge base that's stored in Obsidian. And I've still got a few filters here that I'm excluding, and archive and assets like image files and things. And this is growing for me. So to bring it home to decentralized organization and building the DAO ecosystem, to me, we can imagine that all of these nodes represent a DAO, right? These could be a DAO in the wider Hypha ecosystem, and they're networked together by relationships. As Dominic identified, is the really important piece of the puzzle, is that we're building relationships between entities, between communities. They could be local communities. They could be topic specific communities like regenerative movement DAOs or permaculture DAOs or whatever it is. And if we can represent this, and if we can carry this forward into the future, then we can allow filtering and matching and discovery of relationships within the emerging Hypha ecosystem. And that is about adding dynamic relationships where communities, contributors can achieve more together, and obviously have more fun doing so. So hopefully that was useful for folks at home who's starting to understand this new concept of a knowledge graph and how we can organize knowledge and how that's relevant to the growth of the Hypha ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel, for this. I think just I wanted to reflect that when you were showing this, it really reminds me how most of the things in DAO ecosystem follow different principle, right? Like either they don't follow hierarchical principle, but we even see here in knowledge graph, we have relationship. And like I see that this type of pattern follow from kind of lower levels of like code base all the way to kind of how we communicate, how we gather, how we kind of exchange knowledge. And I also see the biggest usage of these things in collective sense making, which I think maybe Joachim can speak more about. But I just see this like because before in previous episodes we talk about that kind of in traditional organization you have this person who has immense amount of pressure to make certain decisions, right? And like these tools really decentralize that. It's like really kind of creating this collective brain that can be created in different ways. Obsidian is one way, and it's very good of representing what we talk about. But it's really like gathering all the different inputs and then kind of visualizing them and then making decisions together. So I see this as kind of method, and it's very interesting because 2 or 3 years ago when I heard it, it was like highly geek topic in kind of in like very close circles, and now I would never imagine that we will speak about this topic in Hypa. So it's very interesting how this topic and emerging, and I think it has to do with kind of managing complexity and also this connection of kind of how we make decisions that are not based off let me tell you or like I know, but like what's some other parameter, which is also related to our previous conversation of kind of meritocracy, right? It's like who has merit, I see this tool, it's not like one person that has merit, but it's like this collective knowledge gather, and then we can all look at it and then decide and kind of reflect on it. But we need to have, like in traditional organization, I imagine like one person gets kind of all of these stats analysis, and then he said, oh, we are going to do this, right? And in here, we are kind of trying more to gather things in a different inputs, and then everyone has their own kind of view of the situation and can navigate these things. So yeah.
Great, very nice, Sunny. Love the word collective brain that you were using there. That is critical here. What we're building is really a collective brain. And it's also a very tangible aspect of that, because that means there's something out there built with the entities, with these nodes and these relationships here that is almost physical, right? And you can see it in front of you, as Gabriel showed with his personal brain, right? Which is great. I have a friend of mine, Jerry Mikulski, who also has used a tool like that, and he's done that for 25 years. And he's created, I think, 500,000 entities inside his brain and over 1 million or so of these relationships. And he's going on tour and showing that to everybody, right? So you can see his brain, in all details. It's just mind-boggling, how much information he can store and how accessible this becomes. But it's your brain, that's the other thing, We're moving now from this personal brain, or as you mentioned, Arseny, it's the personal knowledge management space, right? That's a term coined by Harold Jarkey, another colleague of mine in the past, who said, well, yes, there's knowledge management, but it mostly happens on a personal level because you want to know and you want to understand, you want to, figure out ways to represent what you're doing and show that to others. And, things like you mentioned also Niklas Luhmann with, it's actually German, and he invented this Zettelkasten thing, right? That's a great way of getting your thoughts organized. So it's really about organizing thinking, structuring the thinking, and then you can write better, you can express better what you're doing here, right? So bringing that now into sort of this next level up of the collective brain, right? So from the personal brain to the collective brain. And I think there's this new tooling coming, moving away from the old, more structured, rudimentary things of, let's say, entity relationships, SQL databases who have rows and rows and rows, right? And it's still used and it's very effective, to serve up a lot of data, in a short amount of time if you have the right queries, right? But it doesn't contain the complexities we see, I think early on in the development of our DAO, we were also looking at, are we using traditional, database-driven tools, or should we move to a graph database? And that's when we, I think, made the right decision to say, there's a middle layer here, and it's a graph database. It's not a SQL, it's not a, traditional entity relationship thing any longer, because now we can start to query, using things like GraphQL, a query language, to tap into that knowledge, right? To tap into that and then build new user interfaces on top of that. And that's the thing that we're changing now. Because it's open source technology, because we're gathering all this data, collecting all of these data in these graph databases, we can also publish these access points, right? And say, well, tap into that and build your own user interface, what you find in our database, right? Nobody prevents you from doing that. And we want to see more richness, and more innovation in that space. And we can provide that through things like GraphQL, or there's another query language, I think it's Cypher or so, that others are using. So ways of tapping into that, standard ways, right? So you know what kind of queries to build, and then serving them up in these new and innovative user interfaces. And just one more thing here to add, for Hypha, we're putting this data in there. So it represents what a DAO contains, for example, proposals. So you have an object in there in this graph database says somebody created a proposal. Here's who created it. Here's the summary of it. Here are maybe some tags, what this proposal is about. Here's now the voting process attached to that. You can see who voted on that. You can see in which direction it voted. Yes, no, you can see the results of the vote. You can see the duration of the vote. You can see other items like a versioning, that comes out of this. So suddenly you see a whole universe of data points being captured by a simple proposal that was put up inside a DAO, right? So if you can tap into this and then surface that in a GraphQL endpoint, then you have an incredible amount of structured knowledge in there, right? And for us, the next stage, I think, is now, should we look at standardizing this kind of data, right? Should we say a proposal typically has these data elements, so others can actually, agree around that structure and come up with their own proposals in their own systems, right? So suddenly we have two proposals in totally separate systems. We're able to talk to each other. And this is for me the fascinating piece of, intersecting these graph databases. They can be separate things and they can talk to each other, or they begin to standardize and agree on certain structures and data elements that then can be used to be combined, right? And then you have a merger of two of these brains, tens of these brains, hundreds of these brains, right? And then suddenly you have this intelligence explosion that we can spawn with the advent of the DAO and other technologies.
Yeah, please don't. It's amazing to go down these rabbit holes, I think. And so maybe I've got an example. The hundreds of DAOs in the Hypha Network are going to be creating proposals about specific topics. And as their community grows, different types of proposals may become relevant, such as code of conduct or moderation policies, or how to create working groups, which we call circles. If we have the ability for them to query the data shared in that collective brain across hundreds of DAOs, looking for patterns or looking for best practice or looking for inspiration about things that they can adopt, then again, it's like begs that question of how much benefit can come through having this knowledge graph accessible in a user-friendly way by hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands over time of entities, small DAOs, large DAOs, these organizations that are managing things in a decentralized way, and just the amount of rich, useful, practical, honest data. The one thing that data is pretty honest. People can interpret things and make it dishonest. I think Bill Gates was caught reading a book titled How to Use Statistics to Lie or something along those lines. Literally, there's a photograph of him. I don't think it was photoshopped either. But yeah, just the amount of the data really, data is data. It's honesty. It's fact. And then if we can find ways to make that useful for all of the DAOs in the ecosystem, I just think it's a tremendous value. And I think it paints a picture, part of the picture that we're unclear of. Just as we're learning to use artificial intelligence in a lot of what we do this year, that's suddenly become a thing. Dom can speak a tremendous amount to AI and how that might influence as well what happens to decentralized organizations. Same with this ability to manipulate and filter and match data for different use cases.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And in this kind of broader container that we are speaking, and also in terms of DAOs that are part of our ecosystem, there is like this technological aspect. And I notice on social media sometimes this discussion, like, why do we need technology, especially in these like permaculture circle back to the land, which are like fed up with this, and then they're like, yeah, we want, but there is this kind of always like, do we need technology or we don't need technology? And for me, this is kind of one of these things that is showing us like real power of technology. It's like this Marshall McLuhan thing that it's like, new medium always first copy the old medium, but then it kind of develops on its own. And I see like DAOs and also personal knowledge management as kind of something that's like very native to technology, very native to the internet, and it cannot, like, it can exist in the books, but it can exist maybe on personal level, but it cannot exist on collective level. Kind of closest thing to that is library, but library is just data points, right? It does not offer connection bit. Like the only connection is like, okay, this is like fiction or this is non-fiction. So like there is this categorization that is relationship. But also I think it's very interesting because it has this network effect, right? The more DAO use it and the more they kind of create, it will kind of generate these insights, and then other people can reuse these things. And then just last part that I want to mention, that I was really thinking about AI and this kind of thing that will AI replace us? But then I was reading recently the newsletter from Charles Eisenstein, and he was talking about that and kind of how AI, if you fed AI kind of on its own data points, basically when like AI is trained on our data, but then when you stop feeding it our data and just start feeding to itself, it starts getting worse and worse progressively. And I think that's very interesting because it shows us that AI is here to that we are here to have relationship with AI rather than like, oh, okay, AI is going to replace us. So in this context, I really see it like if there is no input anymore to AI, but AI just is inputting it in itself, it will start getting worse. But in this case, like this type of tooling is really there to feeding then all of this data into some like related technology that I don't know if we want to go deeper, but just want to mention like vector databases, which are instead of you generating insight, it's like AI saying to you, okay, I see this connection, is this relevant? Or like I see these things, is this relevant? So I think that's very exciting because at the end it's really able us to operate on higher level of complexity instead of managing now like these small things. We are seeing this connection and then we are deciding what's happening by this connection, which I think is next level of organizing, which is really embedded in technology. So it's like we have this organization which are DAOs, and then we have this technology, and then these two things really go together. You cannot go one without the other. That's why I think the knowledge management methodology will become more and more relevant and essential part of organizing in the future.